Old Norse, and the Old West. Two directions that have influenced the direction of my life, and while being different cultures, do have some similar characteristics. I think that many frontier cultures around the world share a regard for independent, self reliant masculinity that manifests in a similar martial character. In Old Norse, this is often called drengskapr, the state of being a drengr, or brave, reckless, and honorable man. And there's an interesting tale that reflects some of the nuances of drengskapr called Thorsteinsdottir Stangarhóks. This is often translated as the short story or tale of Thorstein Staffstruck, but I think that calling Stangarhóks Staffstruck is a little too formal in tone. I would prefer perhaps Thorstein Stickbeat. In the story, we have an Icelandic farmer named Thorstein who lives on the farm of his father Thorarin, and nearby is the farm of Bjarni, who hires many men, including an individual named Thorður, who has a somewhat sour temperament. Thorstein and Thorður often host horse fights, which are a form of entertainment in Viking culture where men bring their stallions and have them fight one another, and the men goad the stallions with sticks. So Thorstein and Thorður have their stallions facing off, and each one is goading his stallion, but tempers get a little high in the passion of the game, and Thorstein and Thorður each end up hitting each other's horse with their sticks, and at some point, whether by accident or in anger, Thorður hits Thorstein in the face with a stick. Well, this is a difficult situation for Thorstein because, of course, the rules of drengskapr, of Old Norse manliness, as well as the Old Icelandic law code, provide that there must be some kind of response, some kind of aggression in turn in response to any kind of physical damage to oneself, and this blow in the face with the stick certainly counts. But Thorstein understands that it's an accident, or he knows that Thorður is just sort of a buddy from another farm. He doesn't want to get into a conflict with him, and so he says nothing. He patches himself up, and he asks everyone there not to talk about it, and especially not to let his dad know. Because, of course, the father of the household has a strong motivation not to have anyone else in his household known for not fulfilling the Drengr ideal. Because, of course, if you have any softies in your family, other families in the neighborhood may be inclined to take advantage of you. So, for a while things go all right, but of course people gossip, and one day Thorstein gets up early to go and do his chores, and he gets them done relatively early, so he comes home and gets in bed again to catch a few more winks. And his dad comes by and he says, "Oh, why are you resting, son?" And Thorstein says, "Well, I've done my chores for the morning." And Thorin says, "Oh, it's not because you were hit in the face with a stick." So Thorstein realizes this has gotten to his dad. Now there's really nothing for him to do except to take some kind of compensation from Thorður, either to get him to say that it was an accident, or to get him to give him something in return to show that he still has his respect, or perhaps to take violent action against Thorður. So Thorstein goes over to the farm where Thorður works, Bjarni's farm, and he confronts Thorður. And he says, "Hey, could you tell me whether this was an accident or whether this was an intentional blow?" And Thorður says, "Well, with one mouth you can say that it was an accident, and with the other mouth you can say that it was intentional, and that's all the compensation you're going to get." This might have been a better comeback in medieval Iceland. Thorstein doesn't like that, so he kills him. But Thorstein is an honorable man, so he rides into Bjarni's lands. He finds a woman who works for Bjarni, and he tells her what's happened. He tells her that he's killed Thorður, and he rides home. Since conflict between neighboring families was such a part of life in Old Norse society, killing itself didn't necessarily have some kind of moral problem. it really, the moral problem is not standing up for your killings, not being open about it. Murder is secret killing, not necessarily just killing, period. So Thorstein goes home, and Bjarni, who respects Thorstein, doesn't initially want to do anything either because, well, he respects him and he doesn't want to have a conflict with this guy, especially he doesn't want to kill him. He's a Dranger that he respects. But time goes by, and Bjarni overhears his two workmen who originally began gossiping about Thorstein's blow to the face with a stick, talking about how Bjarni doesn't stand up for his workmen. And of course, Bjarni can't have this. He can't have a reputation as being someone who's soft on people who have hurt his employees. So he sends these two men the next morning to go kill Thorstein. However, Thorstein is a better fighter than either one of them, and he defeats them both, and he sends them back to Bjarni, packed over their horses. Bjarni tries to let it sit for a little while longer, but sure enough, before long, his wife Randveig begins to work on him about it and say, you can't just have this guy who's killed 3 of your workmen just going free. You need to take some action here, because of course people will begin to say that the family is weak. Bjarni finally lets himself be egged on. Very often in these sagas, it's women who egg the men into breaking the peace and getting violent retribution. So Bjarni suits up in his armor, grabs his weapons, and he goes over to Thorstein's farm. And he says that he wants to have a duel. He wants to resolve this with violence. Thorstein says that he would happily leave the country, that he would accept lesser outlawry, which is to leave Iceland for 3 years, and to be unprotected by the law if you come back to Iceland for those 3 years. But Bjarni says it's too late for that. He wants a duel. Well, Thorstein accepts, but he goes and tells his father what's happening. His father seems to accept that this is a reasonable outcome to things. He says, all right, well, I would rather lose you than have an Arger son. Arger is the opposite of Drenger. And so Bjarni and Thorstein begin their duel. They fight for a good long time. Both of them get some good hits in. But after a little while, Bjarni says, you know what, I think you're getting an advantage over me because I'm getting thirsty. Will you give me a break so I can get some water? Thorstein says, of course. So they break, and Bjarni goes down to the creek, and he begins to drink out of the creek, out of his helmet. Thorstein comes up and picks up Bjarni's sword that's lying there next to him. Now, in a modern action movie, of course, Thorstein would then hold that sword to his throat and say, and do whatever. He would probably end the fight in some way by taking Bjarni captive. But instead he says, no, I don't remember that you had the sword the last time I saw you, and he begins asking him about the sword. So they talk about the sword a little bit, and then he gives it back to him, and they fight a little bit longer. After a little bit of this, Bjarni says, you know what, you're getting an advantage over me again. Look at our 2 shields. They are really, they're really beat up now. Thorstein says, well, let me go back into the house, I'll get you a new shield. He goes back, gets 2 new shields, and gets another sword and gives that to Bjarni. They fight a little bit longer, this time with Bjarni using a brand new sword from his opponent Thorstein. And after a while, Bjarni says, you know what, I will accept that you would probably be the equivalent of 3 workmen, so why don't you come and work for me? I will take that as compensation for the 3 workmen that you killed, and they resolve the matter that way. It's a funny kind of postscript to this. Bjarni says, hey Thorstein, can I tell your dad about this? Can I deliver the news? And Thorstein says, sure. So Bjarni goes and he plays a little prank on Thorin. He goes in and he says, it goes into the house, and Thorin's kind of old and blind, and he says, Thorin, it's me, Bjarni, your neighbor. I have fought your son Thorstein, and there was no one better with weapons than he is, but I killed him. And Thorin seems to accept this, and he says, well, Bjarni, you're a good Dranger, and thank you for telling me. He says, come a little bit closer, tell me the news, where I can hear you a little bit better. And he's working at drawing a sword underneath his blankets, of course. Well, Bjarni sees this, knocks the sword out of his hand, and says, no, old man, we actually made a deal. Your son's still alive, and he's going to come and work for me. And you're never going to want for anything the rest of your days. I think the story is an interesting illustration, not just of the sort of weird Norse sense of humor that's similarly stoic to the way that, say, Old Western humor is, or Spartan humor is. Many frontier societies have this humor that really emphasizes the sort of hard edges of life in a slightly ironic way. but also because it emphasizes the respect that Drengr enemies have for one another. Right? Bjarni and Thorstein actually highly respect one another throughout this process. Men who fulfill the Drengr ideal, even though they may be in conflict, even though they may kill one another, often have high respect for one another in a way that often reminds me a little bit of sports teams, more than what we often think of as kind of the deadly hatred that enemies may have for one another today. Not that people didn't hate one another, but often the conflicts that come up between landowners are not so much matters of hatred as simple matters of conflict over resources, and of course conflicts that arise from pride, like the story in The Tale of Thorstein Stickbeat. For now, from beautiful Old West in central Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.